So I bought the GoPro Hero 10 a couple of weeks ago now, and just thought, why not do a quick little review on it, just to let you know whether it's worth to spend $500 on a tiny little action camera like this. And as a little added bonus, I thought, why not at the end of this video go through my cinematic settings that I use on the GoPro. So if you wanted to stick around for that till the end, then go ahead. If not, and you wanted to just skip straight to that, take the timestamps down below, and you can go straight to those settings if that's what you're here for. So I just wanted to preface this video by letting you know that it's not an absolute overall in-depth review of this little camera, of every little function it has in it. There are other really great videos out there that do go over every little setting inside the camera. It's just more of an overall review, what I think of it. And also bear in mind that I am actually upgrading from the GoPro Hero 8, which is the last version that I had. I didn't have the 9, and I'm going straight to the 10. I do know a little bit about the Hero 9 just from things that I've read and seen myself, so I will throw that in as and when I can. But yeah, just bear in mind that I'm going from the 8 to the 10. So just reeling off some quick specs about this camera. The new GP2 processor delivers a 2 times faster video frame rates, which means there is now 5.3K up to 60 frames per second and 120 frames in 4K. As well as this, there's 5K 30 frames per second and 4K 60 frames per second in the 4x3 mode, which is the one that I typically use to stabilize footage in real steady. As well as this, there's 240 frames per second in 2.7K, as well as 120 frames per second in 2.7K 4x3, which is again the setting that I'll use to stabilize in real steady. The GP2 processor has also made the touchscreen much more reliable and less sticky than we've had in the past, as well as startup times about a second faster. There is also a upgrade in the Hypersmooth performance, so that we now have Hypersmooth 4.0. So the horizon mode has also improved, allowing you a greater degree of rotation whilst keeping the horizon level. There's a new hydrophobic lens coating on top of the lens cover itself, which allows the water to drip off the lens cover a lot easier than it did before, where it used to stick to the lens coating. So looking at the dynamic range, I feel like the dynamic range has improved slightly. I don't think it's going to be a huge jump just because it's still the same sensor, but yeah, I can notice a little bit from the Hero 8 to the Hero 10, a little bit more in dynamic range from between the darker and the brighter areas. There's more details in those areas, and the colors seem to have improved a little bit as well, I think. So looking at the image quality, in case you're wondering like I was, is there much difference between the 4K of the Hero 10 compared to the Hero 8? Well, here is a side-by-side comparison between the Hero 8 and the Hero 10 4K. And also, is there much difference between the 5K of the Hero 10 and the 4K of the Hero 8? That's something as well that I was interested in knowing. Is there a big difference? So here is a little side-by-side comparison of those as well. Personally, looking at the 4K comparison, I can't really tell the difference. I think they both kind of look the same in terms of quality, sharpness, everything, which I guess is something that you would expect. I also can't really see that much of a difference between the 5K and the 4K of the Hero 8, maybe very slightly more detailed, but I think when you're going to upload to computers and phones, it'll be very, very hard to tell the difference between those resolutions. But I think the reason why it's still nice to have the 5K and the 5.3K is just for, again, for real steady. When I like to use that software, it will typically crop in to stabilize. So being able to have a little bit more resolution, 5K and 5.3K, just means that when it does crop in, it's not losing a crazy amount of resolution compared to 4K cropping in. Another thing that I'm really enjoying compared to the Hero 8 is the way the filter system screws straight on to the lens, rather than having that annoying little magnetic adapter of the Hero 8, where sliding the filter on top of the original GoPro filter, it would just come off at any given moment. Any little crash, or even sometimes when I was flying my FPV drone, ND filter could just slide straight off as I'm flying. And at certain times I've had to actually tape down my ND filter onto the GoPro, which takes time and it's not ideal. So a few things I don't really like about the new Hero 10. I think the main thing is the battery life seems to have got worse from the Hero 8. Even though the battery is bigger, it's the same size battery as the Hero 9, I do believe. And yeah, it just seems to be a little bit worse. And even on a couple of little tests that I've done, it's probably a little bit of a high data rate, and obviously the 5.3K and the 5K and the higher frame rates. It is understandable that the battery life might suffer a little bit, but yeah, just I have to mention that the battery life is not as good as the previous generations, I don't think. Also, with it being a heavier GoPro than the Hero 876 that I've used before, it does mean as well that flight times on my FPV drone have dropped a little bit. I've noticed that Say for example, on the Cinematic that I was usually typically getting 4 to 5 minutes. I'm probably getting about 3 to 4 now. So that's, I guess, I knew that going into it, that it would be the case that putting something a little bit heavier onto top of a drone will reduce the battery life of the drone itself. So I guess it's not really a complaint, it's just something that you need to be aware of, that will happen. And I guess if you fly freestyle or you like to do a lot of maneuvers as well, it's going to affect just general overall performance of that as well. I think just having a bit of a heavier drone, I think the optimum weight GoPro wise, in my opinion, if you're doing like freestyle stuff, which is not something I do a lot, but if you are doing it, I think the sort of 7, 8, the weight of that was pretty optimum, I would say. So the reason I got this camera ultimately is for the higher frame rates and resolutions. I really wanted to have a camera that I could have the 4K 60 frames per second in the 4x3 mode using for real steady. That's just for my own sort of like professional work, let's say, being able to have a little bit of slow motion for if I'm filming action stuff can come in really handy, just being able to do some speed ramps and things like that. That is probably the main spec that I was looking at when I was looking at this camera, and the one that intrigued me the most. The 5.3K 60 frames per second is not in 4x3 mode, which means I'll use the hyper smooth, which is not bad, but I can't see me using it that much. And yeah, so the main spec that I was looking at was the 4K 60 in the 4x3 mode, and all the other little added benefits as well really help. Like I said, the filter adapter, the 2.7K in 120 frames per second in 4x3 mode could be used occasionally as well for myself. So for that reason, I am happy to spend $450 on GoPro, just for the professional aspect of the work that I do. And I think being able to offer the clients more in terms of frame rates and also a more reliable, less buggy camera is something that's definitely worth it for me. However, I think if I was just using this camera for vlogging, behind the scenes, any sort of FPV other than cinematic, I don't think I would buy this camera. I think the Hero 8 would still do me fine. Also, if I was not interested in higher frame rates, let's say any slow motion, I don't really see the point in upgrading to this. I would still stick with the Hero 8, but as I said, because I'm looking to step that up a little bit in terms of quality and higher frame rates in higher resolutions, this is something that stood out to me and I'm happy with the purchase. So as promised, the cinematic settings that I use for the GoPro, start off with the resolution and frame rates. Obviously, I'll leave that completely up to you. That's completely your choice in terms of what you want to film. But the only thing I will say is if you're going to use real steady, make sure you are using the 4x3 mode and you have the stabilization turned off, because otherwise it will not work with that real steady software. Also, one other thing when it comes to real steady is make sure that it's always in the landscape mode, because I did a flight once where for some reason it flipped up into the portrait mode as it was flying. There's absolutely no way to stabilize that either by rotating it around in post and then trying to stabilize it. It won't work. So make sure that you always are in the landscape mode when you're flying. Also, when it comes to lens choice, again, that's completely up to you. If you want to be wide, linear, that's your choice. But again, real steady, you need to be in the wide mode. So coming down to the ProTune settings, make sure you have your bitrate set to high for maximum quality. Make sure the shutter speed is set to double your frame rate for accurate motion blur. So for example, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, make sure that you have a shutter of 1/120. If your footage is really overexposed, by keeping your shutter speed at the appropriate number, it means that you'll need to buy and use ND filters. White balance settings, I'm usually about 5600 for outdoor settings, which is like a daylight white balance. This may need to be adjusted for if you're flying indoors in a tungsten lighting environment, maybe somewhere between 3200 and 4000 Kelvin. The ISO, if you're shooting outdoors, keep it to the minimum of 100 and the maximum of 100 to have the least amount of noise. If shooting indoors, you can push up to 400 ISO max, in my opinion. So the sharpness keep low, as well as the GoPro is already sharp enough, in my opinion, without adding more sharpness. And keep the color profile as flat to allow the most dynamic range when it comes to color grading. So that's it. I hope this video was useful for you, and if it was, drop a like. That will help me out a lot. As always, subscribe to see more videos in the future, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.